Hi, I'm David Valdez, and I teach high school at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today's video will discuss types of political entities, including nations, states, nation states, stateless nations, multinational states, multi state nations, autonomous and semi autonomous regions. So, what are we going to learn? While the state is the basic building block of the world map, there are several different types of political entities in the world. Among them are states, nations, nation states, stateless nations, multinational states, multi state nations, semi autonomous regions, and autonomous regions. Last video, we went into the definition of a modern state, so let's go ahead and review what a modern state is. The modern state is actually a word that is synonymous with country. Its characteristics include the fact that it has a spatial extent. A state also has a permanent population living inside of the area. It has defined borders. A state has a sovereign government. And a state has recognition from other states. Normally, when we think of states, we think of something like Texas or Colorado or even California. But in this particular video, we need to understand that a state is actually a country and not a political subdivision of that country. Nation is not exactly what you think it is either, because a nation is not a country. A nation is actually a group of people, and that group of people has a shared similar culture. They also have a historical attachment to an area or homeland, and they seek some sort of degree of political control over that homeland. A national group is something that's very important to culture and region as a part of this political geography unit. So when you start to combine the two, you get a nation state. And a nation state is an area where the borders of the national group's homeland coincide with the borders of the state. The population is linked together through common culture and history. So nation states tend to be small or somewhat isolated, but it is important for you to understand that of all the national groups that are out there, this is the preferred form for national groups. Really good examples would include Japan and Iceland, where in Iceland, for example, nearly everybody has the same heritage, the same language, the same culture. And because they're on an island, they are isolated from everyone else and they're able to govern themselves. A stateless nation is a national group that's spread out over several different states. So, what this really means is that you have a group of people where they are a minority group in each state where they reside. This means that they have very little political power in each of those states. And as a result, they're not able to organize or even try to become a nation state themselves. Best examples of this are the Kurds who live in the Middle East and Palestinians who also live in the Middle East. A multinational state is a country where we have several national groups inside of their borders. This is probably the most common form of state entity because there are very many national groups, but there are actually very few states. So essentially, what happens is that you get one group that's dominant, and that group controls the political, the economic, and the social power. Good examples of this include places like Canada, where there are several national groups, including the Quebecois, the Canadians, as well as several First Nations group. Also, Russia, with its large area, has a lot of different national groups that are inside of it, and each of those groups has their own homeland and speaking their own language and having their own traditions and customs. A multi-state nation is where we have that national group homeland And that national group actually controls a state, but also spreads its borders into, or the national group actually spreads across its borders into other states as well. The national group is able to control the political and economic and social power in its own country, but it also has influences in other countries. Very good examples of this include Germans, Koreans, where you have one group of people who speak the same language and have the same culture, but they're spread out essentially over two different countries, North and South Korea, and Hungarians. Autonomous and semi autonomous regions are defined areas that are inside of the state. Now, they are autonomous because they're given a moderate degree of self government and freedom to govern themselves. So, the amount of freedom that each of these areas has is going to determine whether or not they are semi autonomous or autonomous. So, a good example of semi autonomous regions are places like Hong Kong, which is given its own government by the Chinese, but the Chinese insert themselves when things go wrong. Also, Macau, which is another small little area outside of inside of China, I'm sorry, that has a Portuguese population, and they are able to govern themselves to a limited extent. Autonomous regions have a high degree of self government and freedom to govern themselves. So, the best examples of these are Native American reservations in the United States. Native American reservations do not have to follow the laws of the state that they're in, and they have their own government, tribal government, and they have their own tribal police, and they do almost everything for themselves with limited input from the national government. Other examples include the Cook Islands and Niue, which are parts of autonomous regions of New Zealand. So let's practice. Here's a free response question from one of the earlier tests taken for the AP Human Geography test. A. Define the following concepts as they are used in political geography: nation, state, nation state. For each of these concepts, name a specific 20th century, late 20th century example from region A and a specific late 20th century example from region B on the map on the left. So the definition of a nation is a group of people who have a similar culture and an attachment to a homeland, who are seeking to have some sort of independence or some sort of sovereignty. A state is a country. It has defined borders, it has a permanent population, and it has sovereignty and recognition from other states. And so it is considered to be a country. A nation state is when the national group's homeland, uh, the boundaries of that national group homeland coincide with the boundaries of a particular country. For each of these concepts, for example, in region a good example of a nation would be the Catalonians. It's a group that you've seen in the past, and in case you guys were wondering, it is the group that is featured on the illustration in the slide before. A good a good example of a 20th century example of a state is any one of these countries that are there, because every country is actually a state. So you could have picked any one of these from Italy to Portugal to Norway to Russia. And an example of a nation state would be something like probably a small area like Slovenia or Denmark, or one of the really small homogeneous countries that we find there. In region B, a good example of a nation would be the Kurds. The Kurds are a national group, and so they have their own homeland. They just don't have their own sovereignty. A good example of a state would be something like Saudi Arabia or Yemen or even Iran or Iraq. And a good example of a nation state would be Israel.
Nope.
So,
Nope.
what should we take away? Well, there are several different types of political entities. While the world has fewer than 200 countries, there are several hundred national groups. Many of those national groups are trying to gain their freedom to become nation states. Understanding the role nationalities play in the politics of creating new states and breaking down established states and governing states is crucial to our study of political geography. Thank you for your time.
Yo, this dude.